It's a sheer delight to be here tonight, my hometown, which I love, in a very sentimental way, so beware. But I do love being here, and thank you for the welcome you've given me. This evening's presentation is about the Reverend William Lax, a Wigan lad born in 1868, became a Methodist minister in Poplar, where he became both a local and a national celebrity. A remarkable man, and died in 1937, but is still remembered by some today. I feel intensely proud of him as a Wiganer, and I hope you will as well. I'm going to say a word about my personal interest in William Lax, and then there'll be broadly two sections in the presentation. We can have the next slide now, David. Where's he gone? Oh, there. I'll do the personal context first, and then I'll say a bit about the Lax family and the Wigan lad. Then we'll have a break. That's the Wigan bit. Then we'll have a break, and then we'll talk about his Methodist ministry, his celebrity in Poplar, and his legacy, which is still there today. So that's broadly what we're doing. But let me say a word about my personal context, and my credentials for being here, and my limitations. Hey, don't take too many lights out. I can't see what I'm writing. Hang on a minute. I'll need a torch. Yeah, I don't mind, but can you see with the lights on? You'll get rubbish if the lights don't go on. You might even get rubbish when they're on, but I'll try not to. Yeah, turn them on. Do you mind? Yeah. Well, let me just say a word, introduce myself. As I said, I am a Wiganer, born in Billinge Hospital many, many years ago. I'll not tell you when. Went to St James's Road County Primary School. Anybody else? Oh, good. Oh, my sister's here tonight, so that is somebody else. Apollon Grammar? Oh, there must be somebody else from Apollon Grammar. Yeah, that's wonderful. Surrounded by family, mainly in the Orrell and Billinge area. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. And one of my great uncles was a man called Sam Cadman, the last nail maker on Orrell. And I feel very proud of him. We have a picture of him in our house. And I loved my visits to the hometown, to the centre, to Wigan. I saw the other day the 352 and 362 buses still go to Wigan, and it was somehow quite moving to see them still running, because they used to take me to Central Park, to Springfield Park, to the pictures, to the theatre, to the market, even to the shops. I played a cool piano in a very poor jazz band in church halls all over Wigan. Anybody remember me? So I clearly didn't do very well at that. No. We were called the Glendale Five, or if someone missed the bus, we were called the Glendale Four. All right, we were pretty hopeless. I went to university fully intending to come back, and I never have done. Studies and work have taken me to Leicester, Leeds, Bristol, various parts of London, lived in France, lived in South Korea, and I've been in Hitchin, Hertfordshire for the last 34 years. I married a non-Wiganer. Careful, she's here tonight. So this is my wife, and I'm glad I did marry her, so there we are. But she's a non-Wiganer, but she's quite sympathetic to what we're doing. We have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all over the south of England, from London to Devon, and one in Australia. So I doubt now I will come back, sadly. But all this time I have had enormous pride in my hometown. I defend it, I commend it, I'm sentimental about it. If you ask my children, they'll tell you I am boring about it. All right. I joined the Wigan Local History and Heritage Society some years ago, but being 200 miles away, I was restricted just reading past forward and seeing the occasional recording of events. And the pandemic changed all that. I was able to join in Zoom meetings, and it's lovely seeing some people tonight whose faces alone have I seen on Zoom. It's really nice to see you all. I'm on what we call the executive, Claire, or we're on the committee. I'm a member of the committee, and I organise and chair the monthly Let's Talk About History Zoom sessions, which are great, and I do commend them to you. Being so far away, I can't do anything that's terribly local in terms of research. So when Claire asks us, as she does every year, what is your special interest in Wigan? I always put Wiganers who have made their mark outside the town. And there are hundreds of them. There are historical figures like Gerard Winstanley, whom I'm very proud. There are entertainment figures from George Formby to the Verve. There are sporting figures. I was so proud to hear about Sir Billy. I almost wept. And I'm waiting for the day when it will be Sir Andy Farrell as well, all right, because I think he might get it too, Rugby being honoured. But there's also a host of unsung Wiganers. And one of the features of our Let's Talk About History sessions is that we are dealing with fascinating characters from Wigan, most of whom I've never heard of. And I want to pay a special thanks to Ken Scally, who's here tonight. Where are you, Ken? Down there, who has an incredible gift for discovering Wiganers I've never heard of. And they're great. They're some remarkable characters. And I hope that you will give more talks here, Ken, in the future. And one of these relatively unsung characters is William Lax. And here I need to mention my Methodist heritage. My family came from Wesleyan and primitive Methodists. In fact, my mum and dad were married in 1932, which was the year of Methodist Union. So they symbolised it, they came together from those two traditions. I owe so much to the Methodist Sunday School and Youth Club. I was, I'll be honest, for 20 years a Methodist minister, working for some of that time in the area where Lax worked. And these days, I'm a respectable member of the Church of England, but I still retain my Methodist instincts and values, and I always will. And one part of my Methodist background, you have the next slide, is this book, Lax of Poplar, by himself, which was written in 1927. It was on my grandma's bookshelf in Orwell, bookshelf in Orwell. We didn't have a bookshop. It was handed down to her children, and it came to me a couple of years ago. I confess I've been aware of it for 70 plus years, was intrigued by the title, Lax of Poplar, by himself, and also by the inscription in the cover. Right. It says, Primitive Methodist Sunday School Oral presented to Ada E. Green, that's my mum, December 1927. It was a Sunday school prize. And what intrigues me, my mum was 20 then, she was still attending Sunday school, it seems. I've not got behind that. But I was aware of that. But I'd never read it. And about a year ago, I did read it, more or less at one sitting, because I found it so engrossing. And interestingly, he writes it, Lax, in the third person singular. He says, Lax did this, Lax did that, because he didn't like to say, I did this, I did that. He felt it was more modest to say, Lax did that, Lax did this. And it prompted me to find out more about this fascinating character. I discovered he'd written 4 more books, and there they are. I'll mention them as we go through. One of them, Let's Go to Poplar in 1929, Adventure in Poplar, 1933, Mrs. Benger Carries On, don't ask, 1935. And then he wrote a second fuller autobiography, which he called Lax His Book, just before he died in 1937. And this time he used the first person singular. I did that. I think his modesty had gone by then, and you can't blame him. And I found them all totally fascinating. And as well as his books, over the last couple of years, I visited Poplar sites linked to him. I met a 101-year-old lady who remembered him, and I'll quote her at the end of the talk. I've consulted the Tower Hamlets archives on him and found his grave in Eltham, South London. I felt confident enough to give a 10-minute presentation on Zoom a year or so ago, and I'm grateful for the encouragement to give a fuller talk tonight. But I must mention my limitations. I'm not a trained researcher. I'm not good at consulting primary sources, as I ought to be, and I'm not brilliant with PowerPoint, I warn you. So I've been immensely grateful for members of this society who have used their abilities and time to help me. And I want to mention one or two in particular immediately. One is Andrina Silcock. I don't think Andrina's here tonight. She lives away like I do, but she has an incredible facility for going to the records, and she has flooded me with references to the Lax family, and I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to Pat and Will Sharp, who are here tonight, East Enders, Wiganers, living in the East End, who gave me tremendous support and got me in touch with the Tower Hamlets archives. If I say to Dr. Richard at the back, Dr. Richard Simpson, you stopped me going down a blind alley at one point, and I'm very, very grateful to you. And then Claire, I have to mention, because she sorted me out frequently, and she's put the PowerPoint presentation together tonight. So if it goes wrong, blame her. Is that all right? That's all right, Claire, isn't it? Yeah, good. Well done. The mistakes are all mine, actually. So let's start with Lax the Wiganer, the Wigan lad. And first the surname, Lax, which my surname dictionary calls interesting and unusual, which it is. And there are two possible sources for the surname. One is a 7th century English personal name, Leaxa, Leaxa. And it's just a name. It was used in the 7th century. And it gives you the names of Laxfield in Suffolk and Laxton in Nottinghamshire. It's possible. But I prefer the other suggestion, which is it's a Germanic name coming from the German name for salmon. Think Gravlax. And that in turn comes from the word for leaping or lively. It's linked to the word for laughter. And I like that. So the surname could come from someone who sold fish or someone, and I like the thought, who was lively. And I'm going to stick with that one. But whatever. It's a surname that came across to the northeast of England in the 16th century, and you pick it up occasionally in Durham and Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. And it was in 1807 in Leeds, Holbeck, Leeds, that George Lax, the grandfather of our William Lax, was born. He was an iron moulder, and he had a small family. But when he was in his early 30s, he went with his wife, Mary, and family to Hamburg in Germany to establish a factory which was pioneering a new a new way of making steel. And it was while he was there in 1842 that he had a son, Samuel Henry Lax, who is the father of our William Lax. So William Lax's dad was born in Germany, which shook me when I heard that for the first time, but interesting. But after 3 years in Germany, the family came back to England and lived in Eccles in Manchester. And within a very short time, and I'm grateful to Andrina for discovering this for me, his wife died, and we're not sure whether she died in Germany or in England. But whatever, he was a widower. And he married a lady called Anne with an E, Gotts, G-O-T-S. And that again is a mystery. Was she German? Was she English? And I've got to say, if anybody can help me at any point with any of these, please do. But Gotts, does it sound an English name? Or could it be German? We don't know. But he had another wife. And in the mid-1850s, he moved, and his family moved to Wigan, where he got a job as an iron moulder in Hay. And I'm delighted this afternoon, thanks to the Kenyans, to go around the area where the factory used to be. And it was here that Lax's dad, Samuel Henry, spent his teenage years. And like his dad, the Yorkshireman, became an iron moulder, this time in Hay. In 1863, sorry, go on. 1843, I think. That's what I said, wasn't it? Yeah. 1850. Yeah, I've not got it exactly, but I know in 1863, when he was 21, Samuel Henry, Lax's dad, married a lady called Jane Tatley, who was a Wiganer, and they married at Standishgate Wesleyan Chapel. But then things didn't go well. After 4 years married, Samuel Henry lost his job and had to move to Manchester to get work. And it was while he was in Manchester, in 1868, that our William Henry was born in Chorlton-on-Medlock, the 5th of January, 1868. And here there's a bit of a historical quirk, which I had to be helped sort out. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, was also born in Chorlton-on-Medlock 2 years before our William Henry. And I thought there must be a special maternity hospital in Chorlton-on-Medlock. You know, why would these two people be born there? And neither of them came from that area. And this is where Dr. Richard sorted me out. Lax and Lloyd George, they were born in the same place within a couple of years of each other. It was a coincidence, but it was the same reason. Their dads needed work. Lloyd George's dad was a teacher, so moved to Manchester to get the job. Our Lax's dad had to move to Manchester to get a job as an iron moulder. Now, I must admit, I was a bit worried at this point. Could I call William Lax a Wiganer? His dad was he German or from Germany? And he himself was born in Manchester. So it's an enormous relief to discover that within 2 months of being born, he moved to Hindley. So do you share my relief at that point? We are talking about a real Wiganer. He moved to Hindley because Samuel, his dad, got a job, I think, at the Hay Foundry in 1868, and the whole family came here. And the 1871 census, thank you, Andrina, when Lax was 3, shows the family living at 41 Wigan Road, Hindley. Can anybody picture that? Yeah. All right, well, that's where he grew up. But then again, as so often happened, it seemed, tragedy struck. His mum died when he was 3. And in a very poignant moment, which he describes in his autobiography, he said his mother summoned one of her friends called Mary Ann Lowe and literally handed the 3-year-old boy, William Henry Lax, over to her and said, it's quite melodramatic, you know, I'm dying, I want you to look after this lad, and I want you to marry my husband. Which she did. At Standish Gate Methodist Church, exactly 10 years after the first wedding. So Samuel Henry Lax was remarried, and Lax's stepmom, Jane, came to mean a lot to him. They had a daughter called Mary Ellen, who was known as Polly, so a sister for William Lax. And I know that she became Mrs. Eccleston, because he tells us, but that's all I know about her. Has anybody called Eccleston here tonight? No? Oh, well. If you know anybody called Eccleston, let me know, and we'll see if they're related to William Lax's sister. And at that point, Samuel Lax, Lax's dad, got a job as an insurance salesman, which was a growing industry. It was secure, it was well paid, and they moved to 8 Wigan Road, Hindley. 41 to 8. Is that going up in the world? Can anybody picture it? Is what, sorry? Right, a bit more. Well, okay. But they moved anyway. Same road, different number. And that was where Lax lived the rest of his childhood and teenage years. And in his second autobiography, which is this book, Lax, his book, he gives a much fuller account of his experiences of these early years. I just want to pick on one or two, because I do like them. He spent a lot of time in a general shop run by his grandmother, who I think was probably Jane Tatley's mum. He loved it. And he said he was fascinated by how much she stocked in it. And I can picture shops like this, even from my childhood. Hams, flitches of bacon, pots, pans, brushes, kettles, rolls of material, buttons, safety pins, stomach medicines. She was a woman. Oh, and there was a bakehouse just behind the shop. She was a woman of no education. She couldn't read or write, but she had her own way of accounts. She was very happy to give credit to people, but she always knew when they owed her money. She was a shrewd businesswoman, in fact, and I like the thought of her. And I don't know her surname. So he loved that shop. Secondly, he had a great love of nature, and he loved to wander in Borsdane Wood. Does that still exist? Is it still beautiful? He had an enormous love of nature, which will resurface later in his life. At the same time, I've got to say this, he disliked the Wigan Coal and Iron Company because it polluted the air. Interesting mix of love for the countryside and dislike of this sort of industry. He had encounters with death. He writes, I was playing in the village street when a heavy coal cart came along, with 2 or 3 miners walking alongside it. It stopped by my grandmother's shop. I ran to the cart with childish curiosity. In it was something covered roughly by tarpaulin. That something was a dead body. It was my Uncle John, who had been killed by a fall of stone in the pit. At what a price has coal always been won from the bowels of the earth? And I think we can all sympathise with that view. He had his first sight of a lady on a bike. I was sitting on the doorstep. To my astonishment, I beheld what I regarded as an apparition. It was Lily Brayton, the famous West End actress, who I think you've had a session on in this society before. Ken did it. Oh, so we know all about Lily Brayton, whose father and uncle were beloved doctors in our area. I called to my mother in the kitchen. Lily Brayton's coming up the road on a bicycle. With flashing eye and indignant voice, my mother called out, "You impudent young hussy, you!" She wasn't very impressed by Lily Brayton, was she, at that point? And you remember that. Following the 1870 Education Act, William had to go to school age 5. He was terrified. He entered with dread, he said, but was determined to apply himself as eagerly as he could. One day the master saw him writing, hit him on the knuckles with a cane and said, "You silly boy, don't hold your pencil so tightly." This scared me, but from then on, I held my pencils very lightly. And it was that sort of education that he had. He disliked school, to be honest. And I'll say more of that in a moment. And among all these experiences was what he called the world of thoughts and visions, worship and wonder. And he particularly lent Methodism. Let's have a change for that term. For him, that it meant the Methodist Church of Frederick Street, Hindley. We can have the name. Well, there are the other Methodist chapels in the area. There are quite a lot, as you'll see, at that time. But move on, Dave. That is the former Wesley Methodist Church in Frederick Street, which closed, I think, right at the end of the 19th century, to be replaced in 1901 by St. John's Methodist Church, which is a church with a spire in the centre of Hindley. And what's rather nice today, I'm grateful to Claire for these slides. Let's have the next one. It's now the Mahabharat Indian restaurant, which I'm told is very good. Is that agreed? Oh, nobody's been. There you are. And and it's retained many of its original features. It's a very sympathetic conversion, and it's guaranteed the building's sustainability. It's still there, the chapel that meant so much to William Lax. We'll have the next one, Dave, that's inside. They've kept the balcony all around it. I better not advertise an Indian restaurant, but it does sound a good one if you want a good meal out, and you'll be in a Methodist centre, so it'll be good for you. You'll be all right. And it was the place he spent a lot of time at. Sundays were full on, that's my word. 7 a.m. prayer meeting, 9 o'clock Sunday school, 10:30 morning service, 1:30 Sunday school, 6 o'clock evening service, and in case you hadn't had enough, you went back home to sing hymns round the harmonium. And during the week at home, there were frequent times of prayer round the family altar. And he argues very fiercely that none of this was boring or made him priggish. In fact, he found it exhilarating and became increasingly convinced that one day, somehow, he would be a Methodist preacher. And he felt that from young teenage. School continued to terrify him. And at the age of 11, he found a way out. He saw a sign in the window of Davis's printing works in the centre of Wigan, which I guess has gone. Errand boy wanted. And without telling his parents, he applied and was taken on as what they called a half-timer. Work began at 6 in the morning, and then he went to school at 1:30 in the afternoon. But sometimes the other way around, he went to school in the morning and he'd work until 9 o'clock in the evening. And I don't know whether that was common at the time, being a half-timer, but he got away with it. But in effect, he dropped school at the age of 13 or 14 and became a full-time apprentice in the printing trade. And he qualified as a journeyman printer at the age of 21. His teenage years had setbacks and opportunities. Slightly to his disappointment, he never grew taller than 5'3". He was a small man to the end of his life. He did, however, in his own words, discover the difference between a girl and a lamppost, and he quite enjoyed the company of the former. But at the same also, he discovered Wigan Free Library, which had just opened, and he read voraciously the classics and just about everything he laid his hands on. A boy who hated school, but loved reading. But then a setback. He developed a stammer, a painful and pronounced impediment in speech that involved grotesque facial contortions. Imagine the anguish it caused a young lad who loved talking and wanted to be a preacher. And he describes going visiting people and having to flee because the words wouldn't come. But he was cured very dramatically. The Salvation Army had set up a corps in Wigan, in Inns, above a stable. And he went along out of curiosity, remembered that it stunk of horses, but more importantly, 2 lady officers greeted him and put their hands on his head, and his stammer went immediately. I just say what he writes, and from then on, I've got to say, he had the gift of the gab. This increased his resolve to be a Methodist local lay preacher. He was accepted for training and preached his first sermon, not a very good one, he said, at the age of 17. So he was a printer, a preacher, surrounded by family and friends, but he wanted to do more, and if that meant moving from Wigan, so be it. And I will say a word about that in the second half. But I just want to share with you at this point, before we end this first bit, some of his thoughts on what it meant to be a Wiganer. Now, I'm going to share them with you from his second autobiography, and I will invite reaction, see what you think to them. I quote his words, not mine, all right? Why, I wonder, does the mere mention of Wigan inevitably raise a smile? You may speak of other places without producing that result. You may speak of Manchester with never the faintest flicker of an eyelid. You may refer to Heckmondwike with only the slightest sign of a nervous tremor. But breathe the word Wigan, and instantly the most rigid facial muscles curve themselves into smiles. And he confesses to using that technique when he went preaching anywhere. He would begin by saying, I come from Wigan, an opening gambit that always livened up an audience. Now, you come back on that in a minute. And then he tries to get behind this. What about this? Perhaps people may think Wigan is an ugly town. Absolutely not. The parish church is as fine as any. Now wait for this. The boulevards of Wigan are worthy of such places as Malvern or Cheltenham, and I hardly dare say this, or Paris or Naples. I'm only quoting him. And when people say it lacks history, absolutely not. It is an ancient and loyal borough with a venerable past. And he argues maybe it's Wigan's fault that it has developed a brand of humour that has encouraged laughter at itself. George Formby, the peer. And he adds, this is a peculiar form of Lancashire humour. And I like this remark. Why is it that all the funny men come from the north and particularly from Lancashire? Who ever heard of a comedian from Hertfordshire? And guess where I live? Or Rutland. He has a point. Or does he? I don't know. I feel like adding to all that, discuss. Right, let me continue the second part now. In 1890, when Lax was 22, He was told he was doing too much. He had a full-time job as a printer, and he was doing nearly full-time church work. And he was advised to choose printing or church work. And he decided to apply for the post of a lay agent with the Methodist Church. Now, I've been in the Methodist Church all my life. I never heard of this post until I read it about Lax. He was accepted. And you could be sent anywhere. And would you believe he was sent to Beccles in Suffolk, where he earned £1 a week. It was a culture shock. East Anglia, to put it mildly, was not Wigan. A rural Methodist circuit was not an industrial town. He was given a horse. And when you're 5'3", getting on a big horse is not too easy. It was a very dubious advantage. He decided, though, he quite enjoyed full-time church work, so he'd apply to be a Methodist minister. What you call candidate to be a Methodist minister. He had to do a trial sermon, 7 o'clock in the morning at Dis in East Anglia. He made a mess of it. He had to do a written exam. He made a mess of that too. So before he could be turned down, he withdrew his application to be a Methodist minister. And he came back to Wigan for a short time and was advised to try again. And and they accepted him again as a lay agent. They didn't send him to Suffolk this time. They sent him to the Isle of Man. And you'd think it might be frying pan into the fire. In fact, he loved it, Castletown. He was surrounded by good people, and he loved the job. And he decided to try again to be a Methodist minister. He preached well, he did well in his written examinations, and he was accepted, to his great relief. And in 1892, he was sent to Didsbury Methodist College in Manchester, where he trained for 4 years for the Methodist ministry. And he enjoyed that. He'd no academic qualifications, remember, left school at 13 or 14 at the eldest. But he read widely. He didn't pass any special exams at the college, but he grew in his intellectual ability. When you've done your training, you're sent to be a probationer minister, and he was sent to Leeds, which pleased him, because he liked the thought of going to an industrial town. But in 1897, when he was 29, he had an encounter that changed his life. He met a man called Hugh Price Hughes. Now, that name probably means nothing to anybody in this room. Anybody heard of him? Yeah, he was Welsh. Well done, well spotted, yeah. He was the dynamic Methodist leader of their mission movement, and they were establishing church centres all over big cities in England. And Hugh Price Hughes was a law unto himself. He took a liking to Lax, and at the end of a casual conversation, when Lax had been in Leeds for just a year, he's supposed to do 3, he said, "Come and be my colleague in London." There were supposed to be procedures to follow. Hugh Price Hughes didn't bother with procedures, and Lax went to London. He'd never been to the city in his life, but he found himself in what was called the West London Mission, which is where I served for a few years. And he had, would you believe, responsibility for Methodist work in Soho, which isn't a bad place to do Methodist work in, is it? You know, if you behave yourself. It was glorious, he said, but I longed for Hindley. He lived in St Pancras. He met some very interesting people, and among them was a character called Dr. George Severs, Severs, who was a member of Lax's church in Soho. He was a medical officer for London Theatreland, and through him Lax met Mary Lloyd, Albert Chevalier, and Dan Leno. And Dan Leno liked him and said they should set up a double act called Leno and Lax. And that was maybe the beginning of his love for celebrities. And I'm going to add, for being a celebrity himself. I'm trying to get behind his psyche. He loved Theatreland. He also found a wife, Mary Ann Browell, known, probably not very nicely, as Minnie, who came from Blythe in Northumberland. She was the daughter of a Methodist minister in London. And one evening, when they'd been at the theatre, encouraged by this medical doctor — you can't trust medical doctors, I'm afraid, Richard — they went to Mary Ann Browell's house in North London to throw stones at her window so that he might gently awaken the sleeping maiden with his act of love. Trouble was, the stones were too heavy. He broke the window. Minnie and her sisters were terrified. The father frowned in his nightshirt, but an apology was accepted, and Lax was approved as a son-in-law. And he married her in St. Pancras. So it was rather nice. But then, after he'd done 5 years in Soho, in 1902, Hugh Price Hughes appeared again, still a law unto himself, and had a very short conversation with Lax. He said, "You are going to Poplar." And this was a tough appointment. It was one of London's poorest areas. The Poplar Mission was a small Methodist congregation. The church building was in poor repair, but Lax didn't hesitate. It was a place with personality that did appeal to him. And anyway, Methodist ministers only went for 3 to 5 years for an appointment. He could move on. So what's the risk? He went, and he stayed there for 35 years. And Poplar is now probably better known as Call the Midwife, but this is long after Lax, by the way, just like clear that one up. Call the Midwife is post-war. He went in 1902 and stayed till 1937. It was an inauspicious start. There were 17 people at his first service, and the buildings needed attention. He inherited what he called, in a lovely graphic expression, a dread entrail of ugliness. But he loved it. The years were full of experiences and achievements, enough to fill 3 books, and I've got them all here. And already during the interval, someone's ordered one of the Lax's books. He wrote these 3 books. The first one called Let's Go to Poplar, which is full of stories about what Poplar life was like. The second, Adventure in Poplar, also stories about Poplar life. And the third, Mrs. Benger Carries On. How about that? And he calls it an attempt at biography, some record of the extraordinary doings of an ordinary woman, by William H. Lax. She was quite a character. I'll quote a bit of that in a moment. But they all make for fascinating reading. Now, Lax claims that every word in every one of these books is true. But I do wonder sometimes what true means when he writes that word. I think he enjoyed exaggeration, and he knew the preacher's maxim, which is, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Have you ever heard that? Yeah, well, he was a bit like that. But what comes across in these 3 books is that Lax was a pastor, a preacher, a campaigner, a politician, a sharp wit who enjoyed a good argument, a man who loved the area of Poplar for what he called its homeliness. He was a man who could get alongside everybody from the poorest of the poor to the rich and the famous, especially if he could tap their wealth for church purposes. He was a specialist at that. He was a 5'3" dynamo with a Lancashire accent. And even allowing for some hyperbole in what he writes, his achievements were considerable. His congregations grew by hundreds. He started a sisterhood which attracted 1,300 women on a Monday afternoon and a men's club with 300 members. He denounced the evils of alcohol and betting, but he got on well with drunkards and gamblers because he could tap their money. Within 4 years of arriving, he was made an alderman of Poplar Borough. During the First World War, he was appointed chairman of the Borough Food Control Committee. Can we have a couple of the next slides, David? That was the church he inherited, Poplar Methodist Church, Poplar Wesleyan Church. And then he met George V, and he got on well with him because George V was fascinated by the fact that he'd stayed a long time rather than the 3 to 5 years. And they had a good chat, and the king was satisfied with him and gave him some money. And with the money, he secured another building, which he called very cleverly King George's Hall and Institute. And in there, he set up a Sunday school for 800, a day nursery, uniformed organisations, a cinema, a social work centre, a gymnasium, and a cancer control clinic. We'll have the next slide. This is where he lived. I love this picture. Thank you, Pat, and for giving me. I love the bins. I don't know why. Go to the next one. I know. That's all right. That's where he lived. And during the First World War, it was struck 3 times by a bomb or shrapnel. But he stayed because he loved it and he loved the people. And it's quite a nice road, isn't it, these days? It looks all right. And that was his manse. He campaigned for better housing, and remembering his love of Bosdane Woods, more beauty in the form of parks. He campaigned for an old age pension at the age of 60. How about that today? All right. His church was the first Methodist church to support votes for women. He took a leading role in civic events. And there's one rather touching slide. I think it's next. There he is. He's leading a ceremony to mark probably a year or 2 after a bomb fell on a primary school in Poplar when many, many children were killed. And there he is. You can see how small he is, leading a service of remembrance surrounded by the great and good of Poplar. And this came from the archives, and it's lovely to see it. He bought a building in Essex, on the Essex coast, as a holiday centre for people from Poplar. And then in 1918, when the war ended, we'll have the next one, he was mayor of Poplar. I love that picture. He wasn't a very dignified mayor, I don't think. This is a picture of him on a carousel when he was mayor of Poplar. He turned down an opportunity to be Poplar's Liberal MP. But he was a great friend of George Lansbury, who from 1932 to 35 was the leader of the Labour Party. But he didn't want to be an MP in the end. He also turned down the chance to be president of the Methodist Conference. He didn't fancy the idea at all. which is the honour given every year to someone in Methodism. He starred in the first film made by the Religious Film Society, started by J. Arthur Rank. It was called Mastership in 1934, and I can't find a copy anywhere. So there's a project for somebody. Mastership, Religious Film Society, J. Arthur Rank, 1934. He was the star of that film. And he was so well known that his church became known as Lax's. And the local vicar said, I've heard of Congregationalism, Methodism, Wesleyanism, Anglicanism. Is this a new denomination called Lax's? Yeah. And it wasn't. It was because he was such a personality. And all through, there were personalities galore. One of them was Mrs. Benger. Let me just read a bit from... He warmed to this lady. Mrs. Benger was a widow. For 20 years she had struggled bravely and successfully to carry on the business left by her husband. Nearly 60 years of age, she still retained remarkable vitality and vigour. She was unique. Personality exuded from every pore. Character stood in every line of her ample body. She rejoiced in turning the scales at 16 stones. She was built on massive proportions and cast in an expansive mould. Indeed, her large frame and vivid personality suggested her for the part of Mother of the Universe in the drama of life. And she looked the part. 2 individual touches provided the details that perfected the picture. On the left-hand side of her nose, she wore a wart. Yes, she wore it. It was part of who she was. And she had luxuriant tresses. Her hair was her glory and her pride. And she rode a cart pulled by a donkey. And the book goes on about this character. But there are many other characters as well. And there was drama, even melodrama in his life. I say, I think the stories are true, but he does tell them well. He was woken one night, middle of the night, and he had to go and cut a man free from the railway line going through Poplar, who'd laid there to end his life. And he describes cutting the rope, with a penknife to save this man from the railway line. Then he was woken one night by a Chinaman, as he called him, at the door, who he knew to be a gambler. And this Chinaman, this Chinese person, said, would you come with me to a house? So he went in the middle of the night. They went into a cellar, and the Chinese person lifted up the floorboard, and £5,000 was stashed there, the products of his gambling. He was a gambling organiser. And he told him, Mr. Lax, you're the only person I can trust to look after this money. Lax took it to a banker he knew, who arranged for it to be transferred to Hong Kong. And the gambler was very grateful and gave the church some money, of course. And then he found another night thing. He found a small boy in a rather derelict house in the presence of his mother, who had just died. He arranged for his care, and this young man kept in touch with Lax, attended his church, became a police officer, and eventually head of the police force in what was then called the Gold Coast. And Lax was very proud of that achievement. So a lot of drama, a lot of melodrama, a lot of humour, some of it very self-deprecating. And I'll just give 1 or 2 stories which I like. He had a habit of doffing his hat to anybody he met in the street. Nice habit. And he especially liked doing that to charwomen. He was very fond of charwomen, and he saw a group coming along, so he doffed his hat to each of them. And as he was walking away, he heard them saying one to the other, couldn't marry that fella, he'd get on my nerves. And then a young man and a much older lady started coming to his church. And one day, the young man came on his own, and Lax discovered that the lady had died. So he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your mother. You know, how sad." And the young man, of course, said, "It was my wife." And he never came to church again. And then the nice one I like, he used to preach in various places around the country. And when he'd done something, I think it was Birmingham, someone said, "How much do you charge, Mr. Lax?" And he said, 2 guineas. And the man said, "I'll give you 3. Oh, that's nice. And then as he was handing over the money, the man, the treasurer of that church, said, "Oh, by the way, we need a building repair fund. We're building one up. Could you spare anything?" So like gave him a guinea. And then he said, "Our superintendent's wife's not very well. Can you help with the medical expenses?" So he gave him a guinea. And then he was waiting for it. The Sunday school fund needed supporting. So he gave 3 guineas back. And he was conned. And he saw a wink in the treasurer's eye, which was rather nice. And then a nice one, he was good on banter. Someone complained that Poplar was damp and cold and full of Methodists. So Lax said, "Go to hell, it's warm there, and there are no Methodists." One surprising feature, and this is where I can respond to you, Pat, was his travels. He confessed to what he called the wanderlust. He never travelled as a boy, but he tried to take a holiday every 2 years. He tried to go to international Methodist conferences whenever he could, and I think he tapped some of his wealthy friends to pay. So I made a list of the countries he visited, and this is the minimum: Russia, Turkey, Egypt, Palestine, Spain, Italy, Greece, Switzerland, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, various parts of the USA, including Hawaii. Where he got the money, I don't know, but there we are. And then once, when he needed a medical break, he signed up as a crewman on a tramp steamer sailing from Newcastle. And he went to Istanbul, to the Black Sea, and in the Crimea, he met a man from Poplar who became a member of his church and had money. So even in Crimea, he was tapping people for money. Don't ask. And on his travels and in London, he met people and had a knack for striking up conversations. And I'll give you again another list of people he says he talked to. I believe him. All right. On a cruise, he was on a cruise, he chatted to H.G. Wells about his book, The War of the Worlds. On the way back, he chatted to George Bernard Shaw about his plays. Sitting on a bench in Menton in southern France, he found he was talking to Clemenceau, the recently retired Prime Minister of France. On a train from Newcastle, he was invited to travel first class with William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army. He had frequent meetings with George Lansbury, the leader of the Labour Party. And then this one I do like. He went to South Africa and stayed with a Methodist minister there, a friend he trained with called John Howard. One day, at this chap's house, John Howard's house, he met a young lawyer called Gandhi. One evening, trouble was threatened. Lax's friend was apprehensive that personal violence would be used. They had threatened to kill Gandhi. Howard feared for his safety. "Look here, Lax," he said, "let's get him out of this. Give him your clerical collar and hat. They'll just about fit him, and we'll smuggle him away." And so Gandhi left Johannesburg in my clerical attire. I sometimes wonder if we changed the course of human history by that simple act. I find that quite remarkable. He had rich friends who supported him. Some were members of his Poplar Methodist Church. Some were Londoners who liked what was happening in Poplar. He had a lawyer friend in the city who, whenever people said, we'd like to gift to something, would always say, Poplar Methodist Mission. He once travelled on a train from Doncaster with what he called a very charming lady. She seemed to enjoy the conversation, and when they got to London, she invited him to share her chauffeur-driven limousine and took him home to Poplar. She then presented him with a substantial amount of money. He never knew her name. He never met her again, but he had her money. Now, largely due to the intensity of his work, he suffered what we'd now call a nervous breakdown. Some friends were concerned about his health, and one built him a house in Blackheath, which is a very desirable London district south of the river. And he and his wife would escape there. We're still looking for the house, the Sharps and myself, but we'll find it and see what it's really like and how much it's worth today. It'll be very expensive. And it was there that he died in 1937. The funeral was attended by thousands. And he had an impressive grave. We went looking for his grave, and it's there. He died in 1937. We were looking for Greenwich Cemetery, which is actually in Eltham, and on the way, how about that? I think Lax will be pleased about that, rocking all over the world. It's great. It's across the road from the cemetery. That's irrelevant, by the way, but I like it. Keep going. And there's it's very impressive gravestone near the entrance to the cemetery. Next one, Dave. In memory of William Henry Lax, brackets Lax of Poplar, greatly beloved by the people he served for 35 years, he entered into eternal glory on the 5th of February 1937, erected by members and friends of the Poplar and Bow Methodist Mission, also of Minnie, his devoted wife and partner in the above mission, who died on the 22nd of February 1943. When she died, Minnie, incidentally, left £16,000, which in 1943 is not a bad amount, is it? Don't know what it is now. Where it all came from, I don't know. So let me just move on finally to his legacy. I say Poplar is now more famous for Call the Midwife, which was started 20 or so years after Lax. And Poplar today is overlooked by Canary Wharf. It's being gentrified. I think the next slide just is interesting. Oh no, all right. I'll have this first. The Poplar Methodist Church is pulled down. It's still continuing, but in a different way. And that's a block of flats in its place. And if you look closely, next one, Dave, William Lax House is there. And it's a bus stop as well. And some people still call it Lax's. But the church itself now has joined up with a Reformed church in the area, and it meets now in the Queen Victoria's Seaman's Rest, which is a quite wonderful building on the East India Dock Road, which is famous for its work among seafarers, among ex-prisoners, among the homeless, and it's a good bed for the night. But the area itself, let's have the next one, is getting gentrified. I said George Lansbury was the head of the Labour Party, 32 to 35. Very much on the side of the poor. But this is Poplar today. This is the Lansbury Hotel, don't you know? Named after the great socialist. And I don't think I could afford to stay there, because it's just within walking distance of Canary Wharf. Beautiful hotel, which we went to see, the Sharps and myself. But the legacy continues. The minister of the church, who I know in Queen Victoria's Rest, who is Lax's successor, says the lovely thing about this church is there are lots of modern Laxes. There are people still doing his work, and I find that quite moving. I say it's got gentrified, there's lots of money there, but there's a lot of poor people as well in the area. And the church itself is doing a lot of good work, but also other churches are joining in. And I love, go over the next one, Dave. That's called St. Matthias Church, which is not far from, it's in Poplar, and it's overlooked by Canary Wharf. It is used as a church, but it has an incredible range of community activities, which Lax would be proud of. Food, obviously food banks, but other food initiatives, help with jobs, and so on. And to me, what's rather nice, could we have the next slide? I'm very fond of this lady. She's called Sister Christine. She's a Roman Catholic nun. And I think she's about 4'10". And she terrifies the local councillors. All right? Because you know whose side she's on. And she's doing a fabulous job. She would never describe herself as a successor of Lax, but I think she is. And I think that's wonderful. So there's a block of flats that has his name. There is the work going on. And there's something called Neighbours in Poplar. 55,000 meals delivered in a particular year. People saying, you give me hope, you may believe in goodness again. You are Deliveroo angels, which is rather nice. And I rather like, in the middle, if I can find it, there's another Wiganer. Well, I think we can claim him. Sir Ian McKellen. I have lived in this area for over 40 years and seen its change from desolation to apparent prosperity. But in COVID, the reality was revealed. Beneath the high-rise symbols of wealth, living in homes luxurious and humble, are the people of Poplar. Some still thriving, many barely surviving. Neighbours who need health, need company, need food. The authorities do their best, but Neighbours in Poplar, which I think is Lax's successor, does better. The old spirit of the East End has re-emerged. Love thy neighbour as thyself. That's a quote from the Bible and Ian McKellen, so it can't be bad. So let me get one of the last words to a 101-year-old lady I met on one of my visits to Poplar. She has attended the church for 101 years, and she knew Lax personally when she was a youngster. He was little, she said. We know that. He was dapper. I rather like that. He had the gift of the gab, but you couldn't help but like him. Everybody did, because he liked everybody. And I like that as a quotation. I still continue to be amazed that a Wigan lad with a narrow life experience and limited educational background made such a mark in the East End of London. But maybe it's very simple. He did have a passionate Christian faith, can't deny that, of the Methodist variety. He had an innate intelligence, I think, developed in his Wigan upbringing, rather than academic study. He accepted people, the more unusual, the better. These days he would be called inclusive. He could laugh at the world and himself, and he was likeable. And I think that's one of the secrets of this little man who became a celebrity. Thank you very much for listening.